The porcelain teacup didn't just slip, it shattered. It was a vintage Wedgwood piece, a delicate cornflower blue, and it exploded against my kitchen tile into 100 gleaming shards. I froze, the dish towel still clutched in my damp hands. The sound was deafening in the sudden, suffocating silence of the room. Typical, Eleanor sighed, not even flinching at the noise. She didn't look down at the mess. Instead, her sharp, slate-gray eyes remained fixed on my face, cold and unyielding. Absolutely typical, Chloe. You handle expensive things the way you handle everything else in life, clumsily and without a shred of appreciation. My throat tightened, a familiar, burning ache blooming behind my ribs. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to look away from her immaculate, tailored Chanel suit and down at the floor. It was an accident, Eleanor. The handle was soapy. Life with you is a series of convenient accidents, she murmured, her voice dripping with that polished, upper-class Connecticut disdain she wore like a shield. She stood up from the kitchen island, smoothing down the front of her skirt. David deserves a wife who elevates him, a woman who understands the weight of the sterling name. Instead, he married a grocery store clerk's daughter who can't even manage a simple Tuesday morning luncheon. Every word was a calculated needle, designed to draw blood without leaving a visible scar. For 3 years, I had taken it. For 3 years, I had smiled through the passive-aggressive comments, the intentional exclusions from family dinners, and the blatant disrespect. I did it because I loved David. He was a gentle, brilliant architect who had spent his entire life trying to escape the heavy shadow of his mother's suffocating expectations. When he looked at me, he saw me, not a tax bracket, not a social standing. Just Chloe. But David wasn't here right now. He was at a site visit in Boston, leaving me alone in our newly purchased colonial home with the matriarch of Sterling Enterprises. "I'm going to clean this up," I whispered, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to sound steady. I knelt, carefully picking up a large fragment of the blue porcelain. A sharp edge sliced into the meat of my thumb. I didn't cry out. I just watched the bright crimson bead of blood form against the white dust. "Do that," Eleanor said, walking toward the grand entryway. "And while you're on your knees, you might want to rethink your presence at the charity gala this Friday. The governor will be at our table. I shudder to think what kind of embarrassment you'll cause David if you attempt to speak about art or politics." She grabbed her leather handbag from the console table. Before she stepped out the front door, she paused, her profile sharp against the morning light. "You are utterly worthless to this family, Chloe. The sooner David realizes that his little charity case has no place in the real world, the better off we'll all be." The heavy oak door clicked shut behind her. The silence that followed was heavy, pressing down on my shoulders until I finally let out the breath I'd been holding. A tear slipped down my cheek, hot and stinging, mingling with the blood on my hand. I squeezed my eyes shut, leaning my forehead against the cool cabinet. Worthless. The word echoed in my mind, a cruel, repetitive chant. She thought I was a ghost. She thought my life began the day David brought me into her pristine, gated community. She had no idea who I actually was. She didn't know about the grueling 80-hour workweeks, the sleepless nights spent staring at spreadsheets in a cramped studio apartment, or the quiet, relentless ambition that had driven me since I was 18. David knew I was a consultant. He knew I ran a small boutique corporate restructuring firm called Vanguard Solutions. But because David loved me for my heart and not my career, we rarely talked about business at home. He knew I was successful enough to split our mortgage evenly, but he didn't know the true scale of Vanguard. He didn't know that over the last 5 years, Vanguard had quietly grown into a multi-million-dollar powerhouse, specializing in aggressively buying out, restructuring, and saving failing legacy corporations. And David certainly didn't know that 3 weeks ago, a desperate, bleeding cash legacy firm had reached out to my board, begging for a quiet, private institutional buyout to avoid a public bankruptcy. That company was Sterling Enterprises. Eleanor's pride and joy. The empire her late husband had built, which she had been secretly mismanaging into the ground through terrible real estate investments and astronomical executive bonuses. My phone buzzed in my pocket, breaking the trance. I pulled it out with my clean hand. The caller ID flashed. Marcus, Vanguard Legal. I stood up, grabbing a paper towel to wrap around my bleeding thumb, and answered it. Marcus, tell me you have the final audit. I do, boss. Marcus's deep, no-nonsense voice came through the line. And it's worse than we thought. Sterling Enterprises is a house of cards. They skipped their last 2 supplier payments to cover the executive payroll for the top tier. If the bank catches wind of this before the weekend, their credit line gets pulled and they collapse by Monday morning. I walked over to the window, watching the empty driveway where Eleanor's Mercedes had been parked just moments ago. My heart pounded against my ribs, a fierce, cold resolve hardening inside me, replacing the pain. And the acquisition paperwork? Signed from our end, Marcus replied. We officially hold 51% of the voting shares as of 9 o'clock this morning. The capital injection has been escrowed. Chloe, you are officially the majority owner and chairperson of Sterling Enterprises. You hold their entire board's future in your hands. A profound, chilling stillness settled over me. Does the Sterling board know who the majority investor is yet? No, Marcus said, a hint of amusement in his tone. Per your instructions, we used the Delaware shell entity for the filings. They only know us as Vanguard Group. Eleanor Sterling has been calling my office every 20 minutes, demanding an emergency meeting with a new principal to secure the rescue funds before the market opens next week. I looked down at the blood soaking through the white paper towel on my thumb. The pain didn't hurt anymore. It felt like fuel. Schedule the meeting, Marcus, I said, my voice dropping an octave, completely devoid of the timid girl who had just been broken on her own kitchen floor. Tell them the principal will meet the executive board in person. When? Friday afternoon, I replied, staring at my reflection in the dark window glass. Right before their big charity gala. Tell them to have the entire executive suite present, especially Eleanor. You got it, Chloe. I'll send out the formal summons. I hung up the phone and walked back to the broken teacup. I knelt again, but this time, my hands weren't shaking. I picked up the remaining pieces, throwing them into the trash one by one. That evening, David came home. He looked exhausted, his tie loosened, a faint smell of brick dust and rain clinging to his jacket. The moment he saw me, his tired eyes softened, and he pulled me into a warm, desperate hug. God, I missed you, he mumbled into my hair, holding me tightly. The Boston meetings were a nightmare. My mother kept calling me, panicking about some corporate restructuring stuff, breathing down my neck. He pulled back, holding me at arm's length, his eyes dropping to the small bandage on my thumb. Hey, what happened here? I offered him a soft, reassuring smile. Just a little accident with a teacup. It's nothing. David sighed, rubbing his face. Did she come by today? Chloe, look at me. Did my mother say something to you? I looked into his honest, loving eyes. He wanted so badly to protect me from her, but he was caught in the middle of a war he didn't even know was being fought. She was just being Eleanor, David. Don't worry about it. I hate how she treats you, he muttered fiercely, taking my bandaged hand and kissing the palm. She thinks because we don't flaunt money, we're beneath her. I told her today that if she doesn't apologize to you at the gala on Friday, I'm not going. I don't care if the governor is there. No, I said softly, touching his cheek. You have to go to the gala, David. In fact, we both do. But before the gala, I have a business meeting I need to attend. A pretty big one. David blinked, confused. A meeting? On a Friday afternoon? Yes, I murmured, a slow, quiet fire burning in my chest. I'm finally closing a major deal I've been working on for a long time. By Friday at 2 p.m., the atmosphere inside the high-rise glass headquarters of Sterling Enterprises was thick with tension. I stood in the lobby, dressed in a sleek, charcoal gray bespoke suit, my hair pinned back into a flawless, commanding bun. Beside me, Marcus held a thick leather briefcase. They're all inside the main boardroom, Chloe, Marcus whispered as the elevator doors groaned open. Eleanor has spent the last hour telling the board that she's going to put this new investor in their place. I didn't say a word. I just nodded, stepping out onto the plush executive floor. Through the double glass doors of the boardroom, I could see them. 7 board members, all men in their 50s and 60s, looking pale and anxious. And at the head of the long mahogany table sat Eleanor Sterling, looking regal, her hands clasped tightly over her silver-tipped cane, her face a mask of aristocratic arrogance. Marcus pushed the heavy doors open. Every head in the room snapped toward us. Eleanor began to stand up, a rehearsed, patronizing smile on her lips. "Welcome to Sterling Enterprises, I am Eleanor." The moment her eyes landed squarely on my face, the words died in her throat. Her jaw went completely slack, her pristine composure fracturing in an instant as her eyes widened in absolute shock. The silence in the boardroom became absolute. It wasn't just quiet. It was the kind of suffocating stillness that happens right before a storm breaks. Eleanor stood frozen, her hands gripping the silver handle of her cane so tightly her knuckles turned a stark, bloodless white. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, rapid breaths as she stared at me, her mind visibly frantic, trying to piece together a reality that made absolutely no sense to her. "Chloe," she finally whispered, the words slipping out like a gasp. "What on earth are you doing here? Did David send you? If this is some sort of ridiculous prank." "Sit down, Eleanor," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it carried a cold, heavy authority that cut right through her panic. I didn't wait for her permission. I walked straight to the opposite end of the massive mahogany table, the sharp click of my heels echoing off the glass walls. Marcus followed half a step behind me, his expression unreadable as he set his heavy leather briefcase down onto the polished wood. "Chloe, have you lost your mind?" Eleanor hissed, her face rapidly flushing a dangerous crimson as she found her footing. She looked around the table at the confused board members, her aristocratic pride reasserting itself. "Gentlemen, I apologize for this intrusion. This is my son's wife. She clearly doesn't understand the gravity of what is happening here today. Security will escort her out immediately." She reached for the intercom button on the table. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," Marcus intervened smoothly, snapping the latches on his briefcase. He pulled out a thick stack of embossed legal documents and slid them across the table, right toward the center. "Members of the board, my name is Marcus Vance, Senior Legal Counsel for Vanguard Solutions. And this is Chloe Lynn Sterling. She is the principal investor, the majority shareholder, and as of 9 a.m. today, your new chairperson." A collective, audible gasp rippled through the room. The man sitting to Eleanor's right, Arthur Pendleton, the aging chief financial officer, snatched the documents. His eyes raced down the front page, his face growing paler with every line he read. "Oh, God," he muttered, his voice trembling as he looked up at Eleanor, then at me. "It's real. Vanguard Group, the Delaware Shell Corporation, it's her. She owns 51% of our voting shares." Eleanor dropped heavily back into her chair, her cane clattering against the edge of the table. She looked at the papers, then looked up at me, her eyes wild with a mixture of fury and disbelief.
"No.
"No, this is impossible. You're a nobody. Your father worked a cash register. You split a mortgage with my son in a middle-class suburb. Where would you get the capital to buy out a firm like Sterling?" I leaned forward, placing both hands flat on the cool mahogany table, looking directly into her eyes. "I built Vanguard from the ground up while you were busy spending your late husband's legacy on country club memberships and bad real estate speculations, Eleanor. You thought I was worthless because I didn't inherit my dignity. I earned mine. And right now, my capital is the only thing keeping you out of a federal courtroom." Arthur Pendleton broke down, burying his face in his hands. "Chloe, ma'am, please. If Vanguard pulls the escrowed funds, the banks will call our lines by 5 o'clock. We won't survive the weekend. The payroll checks for 400 employees will bounce on Monday." "I am well aware of the numbers, Arthur," I said, turning my gaze to him. "Which is why we are going to talk about restructuring. And we are going to start with the executive tier." I looked back at Eleanor, who was staring at me with a hatred so pure it felt tangible. But beneath the anger, for the very first time since I had known her, I saw something else in her eyes. Fear. Marcus. I commanded quietly. Read the first directive. Marcus stood up, adjusting his glasses. Effective immediately, the board will vote on the termination of the current chief executive officer and chairperson, Eleanor Sterling, due to gross financial mismanagement and the unauthorized diversion of operational funds to executive bonuses. You can't do this. Eleanor shrieked, slamming her hand on the table as she stood up again. I am Sterling Enterprises. My husband built this house. And you burned it down. I replied softly, my voice completely devoid of pity. The vote is a formality, Eleanor. I hold 51%. The motion passes. You are stripped of your title, your executive salary, and your access to the corporate accounts. The room was deathly quiet. None of the board members dared to look at Eleanor. They kept their eyes glued to the table, completely terrified of the quiet woman standing at the other end. You are a viper, Eleanor whispered, her voice shaking with rage as she gathered her designer handbag, her fingers trembling violently. A cold, calculating viper. David will leave you for this. When he finds out what you've done to his family, he will loathe the very sight of you. David loves the truth, Eleanor, I said, watching her stand up. Something you haven't told him in years. I'll see you at the gala tonight. She didn't answer. She turned and walked out of the boardroom, her back rigid, but her step slower, heavier, stripped of the royal confidence she had worn like armor for decades. The rest of the meeting took less than an hour. I signed the emergency funding release, stabilized the supplier contracts, and laid out a strict, transparent operational budget that guaranteed every single low-level employee's job was secure. By the time I left the building, the sun was beginning to set against the Boston skyline, casting long, golden shadows across the highway as I drove back home. When I walked through our front door, the house was quiet. David was already upstairs, getting changed into his tuxedo for the charity gala. I stood in the kitchen, looking at the exact spot where the blue Wedgwood teacup had shattered just days before. My heart was thumping hard against my ribs. Eleanor's words echoed in my head. David will leave you for this. Would he? Would he see this as a necessary rescue, or a betrayal of his family name? Chloe? David's voice broke the silence. I turned around to see him coming down the stairs, looking incredibly handsome in his black tuxedo, adjusting his bow tie. But the moment he saw my face, he stopped. He saw the tension in my shoulders, the tight line of my mouth. He walked over to me, wrapping his warm hands around my arms. Hey. What's wrong? You look like you're a million miles away. How did your business meeting go? I looked up into his clear, honest eyes, the man who had loved me when his mother called me a charity case. David, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. We need to talk before we go to this gala. There's something about my boutique firm and about your mother's company that you need to know. I poured out the entire truth. I told him about Vanguard, about the millions in capital, about his mother's secret insolvency, and finally, about the buyout that had happened that very morning. I didn't hold anything back. I showed him the signed restructuring documents I had brought home in my briefcase. David listened in absolute silence. As the story unfolded, his jaw tightened, and he looked down at the paperwork, his eyes scanning the grim financial realities of Sterling Enterprises. For a long, terrifying minute, he didn't say a word. He just stared at the Vanguard logo, his breath hitching in his chest. David, please say something, I pleaded, my heart aching with a sudden, sharp dread. He finally looked up, his eyes glassy, his expression a complex mix of shock, grief, and something else I couldn't quite define. He let out a long, ragged breath and took a step back, his hands dropping to his sides. My mother, she lied to me about everything, he whispered, his voice cracking. She told me the company was having its best year. She made me feel like I was the disappointment because I wanted to build buildings instead of trade stocks. He looked at me, a tear finally escaping and running down his cheek. And you saved it. You saved the jobs of the people my dad hired 20 years ago. David. Before I could say another word, he stepped forward and pulled me into his arms, crushing me against his chest. He wasn't angry. He was trembling with a profound sense of relief. Thank you, he murmured into my hair. Thank you for saving it from her. He pulled back, a fierce, determined look in his eyes. Now, go get dressed. We have a gala to attend, and my mother needs to see exactly who she was dealing with. 2 hours later, the grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel was glittering under the light of massive crystal chandeliers. The room was packed with the city's elite, politicians, old money families, and journalists. David and I walked in arm. I wore a stunning, emerald green silk gown, minimal jewelry, and a quiet confidence that turned heads as we moved through the crowd. Near the front stage, at the premier table designated for the Sterling family, Eleanor was already seated. She was surrounded by several prominent city council members and the governor himself. She looked pale, her makeup heavily layered to hide the hollow look in her eyes, but she was still smiling desperately, clinging to the illusion of power. As David and I approached the table, Eleanor's smile vanished. She sat up straight, her eyes locking onto me with venomous intensity. "David," Eleanor said, ignoring me entirely as she stood up to greet him. "Thank goodness you're here. You need to come with me right now. We have a family emergency and your wife needs to leave." David didn't move. He stood firmly by my side, his grip tightening protectively on my waist. "We're not going anywhere, Mother. In fact, we're right where we belong." Before Eleanor could reply, the microphone at the main podium clicked on, the sound echoing through the massive ballroom. The master of ceremonies stepped up to the microphone, smiling brightly at the distinguished crowd. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," the announcer began. "Before we begin our silent auction, we have a very special announcement. As many of you know, Sterling Enterprises has been the primary benefactor of this gala for a decade. Tonight, we are honored to introduce the new majority owner, chairperson, and visionary leader of the Sterling Group, who has just injected $15 million to secure the future of our city's grandest institution. Please give a warm welcome to the stage." The announcer paused, looking down at his cue card, his smile widening. "Chloe Lynn Sterling." A spotlight swung across the darkened room, its blinding, white beam sweeping over the crowd until it landed squarely and brightly on my face. Eleanor froze, her glass of champagne slipping from her fingers and shattering against the floor, exactly like the vintage teacup in my kitchen. The gasp that rippled through the grand ballroom was a physical wave, murmurs rising like a sudden tide as hundreds of heads turned toward the spotlight. Eleanor stood paralyzed. The dark red champagne she had been holding pool around her silver-dyed satin shoes, staining the pristine fabric, but she didn't even look down. Her face had gone from a pale, rigid mask to a sickly, hollow white. The sheer, unadulterated horror reflecting in her eyes was vivid. She looked like a woman watching her entire life's work dissolve into thin air. "No," Eleanor breathed, her voice a ragged, desperate friction against the sudden silence of our table. She reached out, her hand blindly swatting at the air as if she could physically push the spotlight away from us. "No, there's been a mistake. Marcus, Arthur, do something. This is a public embarrassment. David, tell them. Tell them she has nothing to do with us." David didn't look at her. He didn't offer a hand, and he didn't whisper a comforting lie. Instead, he reached down, deliberately taking my hand in his fingers intertwining with mine right where the spotlight pooled over us. He looked up at the stage, then looked back at his mother, his expression hardened into a calm, resolute finality. "There's no mistake, Mother," David said, his voice carrying clearly over the whispers of the city council members sitting beside us. "Chloe just saved the legacy Dad actually cared about. You should be thanking her." "Thanking her?" Eleanor's voice cracked, dropping into a harsh, trembling whisper as the governor looked on with polite, calculated curiosity. "She has humiliated me. She has stripped me of my own name. You stripped yourself of it when you stole from your own employees to hide your failures, Eleanor," I said softly, stepping past her. I didn't wait for her to recover. I let go of David's hand with a reassuring squeeze and walked toward the stage. The walk felt completely different from the agonizing mornings I had spent enduring her insults in her pristine parlor. With every step up the velvet-lined stairs of the podium, The heavy weight of 3 years of quiet humiliation lifted off my shoulders. I stepped up to the microphone. The applause was polite, wealthy, and expectant. I looked out over the sea of tuxedos and diamond necklaces, finally letting my gaze rest on the Sterling family table. Eleanor had sunk back into her chair, looking smaller than I had ever seen her, her hand clutching her silver-tipped cane like a life vest in a shipwreck. "Good evening, everyone," I began, my voice clear and steady, echoing flawlessly through the high arches of the ballroom. 3 years ago, when I married into the Sterling family, I was told that value is something you inherit, that a person's worth is measured strictly by the history of their bank account. But true legacy isn't built on executive bonuses, and it certainly isn't built on arrogance. It's built on the hard work of the 400 families who show up to Sterling Enterprises every single morning. I paused, looking directly at Arthur Pendleton, who gave me a sharp, relieved nod from the crowd. "Tonight, Vanguard Solutions is proud to announce a complete restructuring of the Sterling Group," I continued, the crowd thinning into a rapt silence. "We are eliminating executive bloat, shifting resources back to our core operations, and ensuring that every pension, every supplier contract, and every single low-level job is fully protected and funded for the next decade. The empire isn't falling. It's finally growing up." The applause this time wasn't just polite, it was thunderous. The city council members stood up first, followed by the governor himself, their seasoned political instincts telling them exactly which way the wind was blowing. When I stepped down from the stage, David met me at the bottom of the stairs, a brilliant, proud smile lighting up his face. He swept me into a brief, fierce hug before guiding me back through the crowd of congratulatory hands. But when we reached our table, Eleanor was already gone. Only her stained chair and a crumpled linen napkin remained. The following Monday morning, the executive floor of Sterling Enterprises was buzzing with a nervous, electric energy. The heavy, dark mahogany furniture in the lobby had already been tagged for removal, set to be replaced with bright, modern glass and open workspaces. I sat in the chairperson's office, the massive corner room that had belonged to Eleanor's husband, and then to her. The air still smelled faintly of her expensive lavender perfume, but the desk was entirely mine now, covered in Vanguard restructuring files. A soft knock sounded at the door. Marcus walked in, holding a single, crisp white envelope. "Her lawyers delivered this an hour ago," Marcus said, sliding the envelope across the desk. She signed the formal resignation papers without contesting the board's decision. Her exit package is minimal, just the standard baseline contract her late husband drafted 30 years ago. No bonuses, no corporate car, no executive security. I picked up the envelope, feeling the heavy weight of the linen paper. "Did she leave a note?" "Just a message through her counsel," Marcus replied, his voice softening slightly. "She's moving out of the Connecticut estate. She sold it over the weekend to cover her personal debts from those bad real estate speculations. She's relocating to a small cottage her sister owns upstate." I let out a slow, quiet breath, looking out the massive glass window at the city below. There was no joy in the realization of her ruin, just a profound, settling sense of justice. She had spent her entire life building a fortress of pride out of other people's money, only to realize the foundation was nothing but dust. "Thanks, Marcus," I said quietly. "Take the afternoon off. You've earned it." After he left, I opened the drawer of the desk. Resting inside was a single cornflower blue porcelain shard, the only piece of the broken Wedgwood teacup I hadn't thrown away. I picked it up, turning the sharp edge over in my fingers, remembering the heat of the blood on my thumb and the cold cruelty of her voice. My phone chimed on the desk. It was a text from David. "Just finished the blueprints for the new community center. Heading home now. I love you, Chairperson." I smiled, the last remnants of the old pain finally fading away into the bright, morning light filtering through the office window. Eleanor had tried to break me because she thought my silence meant I was empty. She never realized that the most powerful people aren't the ones who scream their worth from the tops of inherited towers. The most powerful people are the ones who quietly build their own foundations in the dark, waiting for the storm to show everyone else what stays standing when the wind finally blows.